Thank you very much indeed, Kyle, too, for a very fulsome introduction to the day and the work that's just been completed, and to myself too. Thank you for all of that. And good afternoon, all members, contributing authors and guests today. Well, there's one thing in common between Rotary and CEDA. If you talk for more than 20 minutes, the trapdoor opens and they take you away. So I'm going to try and be good and stick to the time today. But I should begin by repeating what Kyle said about this report. It's excellent, and it's one of the best reports I think that I've seen turned out, and very timely as well, because I think the discussion about whether or not we are efficient in the services sector compared to the goods sector is not only germane, but so too, and more so, is what sort of standards of all productivity we're going to have to meet to compete in Asia going forward for the rest of this century. So I'm going to touch on some of those issues as we go forward. Now, what I'm going to do is cover 4 areas over the next hour and a half. The first one, that's for you, Kyle. Firstly, the evolution and direction of the industries we've got in Australia, where they've come from, to some extent, almost how they arrived to. The second area I want to talk about is the competitive region we live in, which I said I would touch on, which is what does Asia mean to the future of Australia in the rest of this century and the next. Thirdly is the productivity challenge, which is what this outstanding report's been all about. And finally, what are CEDA's recommendations as a result of all this hard work? Now, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. If anybody wanted any copies of this, any of the slides I've used, you're more than welcome to have them, but they're mostly going to, in fact, underpin what's already in the report itself. But just a very quick reminder of memory lane and where we've come from with the industries that make up our economy over the last 2 centuries. That chart goes back to the 1800 to tell us how important each of the industries were in Australia at that time. Now, we've got 19 industry divisions, and this report by CEDA covers 6 of them, plus a special chapter on digital disruption or digital era, and more about that in a moment. But 6 of the 19 industries are covered by this report. So we're not covering all the industries on that chart, not even all the service industries, but we've covered the ones that are the most important, I believe. That chart simply reminds us that if you go back far enough and look at the red area, you'll find that that was the agrarian age for Australia when agriculture and mining were the dominant industries. The orange-coloured areas were what we call our industrial revolution, which of course Asia's now going through somewhat later than we did. And that was of course dominated by manufacturing. In fact, when I graduated from university, manufacturing was then 30% of the GDP of Australia in 1961. It's now down to about 5%. And if I'd have made that comment or that forecast, then I'd have been put into a lunatic asylum, and everybody would have said, well, the economy would collapse. Well, of course it hasn't. Our standard of living's risen almost 2.5 times since then, so the world does not depend on any one industry and never will. The yellow area is what we loosely call commerce. It's the tertiary sector, and that's of course wholesaling, retailing and transport, because that there is the service industry that conveys the goods from the farm and the factory to the ultimate consumer, be them in Australia or overseas. The green and blue areas are what we call the quaternary, or the 4th level and the 5th level. The green level is mostly to do with either information-related services or financial-related services. Either of those 2 things feature very prominently in those industries, and I won't go any further than that. And the blue area, or what we call the quinary or 5th sector, are the more recent industries. They've always been around, as most industries have, but you can see they're starting to grow as we head deep into this century. That includes health, which of course was one of the 6 sectors that's been looked at in this particular report. So that's where we have been. I might quickly add that each of those industries has been created by one word, and that's outsourcing. In other words, we would never have had an agricultural industry if households had continued to grow their own food, milk their own cows, and grow their own trees, etc. And we would never have had a manufacturing sector if households had continued to make their own clothes at home and to make their own furniture at home or even build a house. In other words, until you outsource, you never create any industry. And it always amuses me when I see great emphasis being put on the technology that creates each new era. and of course we're in the post-industrial era now, or what we call the infotronics era, and we have been since 1965. That, of course, has never been true and never will be true for the next 200 years either. Technology has never, ever created a new age. It's outsourcing creates it. Because if you don't get people to get you to do something for them, you haven't got an industry, no matter how good the technology is. So, if you like, the market always is the thing that starts a new industry, followed by the inventors who think they can supply that market, and then finally the technologists who can make you supply it even more efficiently and more competitively than doing it inside your own home yourself. So thus endeth the lecture on outsourcing, but we often tend to get overrun by technology, and we still are. There are people saying, for example, that robots are going to virtually control everything, there'll be no jobs left by the middle of the century or the end of the century. Well, that's not going to happen either, but it makes exciting reading, and we're not here for that, we're here for facts, which always ruin a good story. Now, where are we right now in the latest figures that came out of the National Accounts just 2 weeks ago? That's where our industries are today in terms of their importance in their contribution to our economy or our GDP, their shares of GDP. And you can see that manufacturing is now just 5.5 or 5.8%, very small. In fact, the goods industries are very tiny. If you take the whole primary sector of agriculture and mining, you can see that between the two of them, they're not even 10% of the economy. So that we've often overrated mining, for example. It's been a very big contributor to an economy that's been pretty sick over the last 6 or 7 years or 8 years. So that's exacerbated or exaggerated the role of mining, because in fact it's the rest of it that's not been doing as well as it should do. The orange area, of course, is the secondary sector. The yellow area, as I said, is the tertiary sector, what we call commerce or distributive sector. And then you've got the green and blue areas, which are all the rest. And that's where most of the research has been done, of course, except for transport, which we did look at, and it was looked at in this report as well. Now, it might be interesting to know, over the last 5 years, where did our new GDP come from and what did we lose? Well, what we lost was simple. It was only one industry lost any of its GDP over the last 5 years, and that was manufacturing. But you can see how much we actually created, and mining contributed very strongly to that. And we can't write off mining too quickly. The only thing that's happened to mining is the prices have come down, but the volumes are still going up. And the volumes will probably continue to grow, maybe not as strongly as recently. My belief is that the mining industry will probably continue to grow its physical output or its tonnage until the middle to late 2020s. So we've got a long way to go yet, maybe another 10 years before the actual volumes of mining come off. And at the moment, prices have recovered a little bit, and that's been helping our economy over the last year. But you can see that apart from mining and a bit of construction, the rest of the economy is growing on the back of services, which is what Kyle has said in her opening remarks and what we do say in this report. Now, employment is not too far different. If you want to look at the proportion of the 12 million employed Australians and ask where are they, you can again see that in this case the primary sector is even smaller. It's less than 5% of all employment. Manufacturing is a little bit bigger than its contribution to the economy. But again, the story is the same. The service industries are dominating. Now, the only thing I should pause for just a brief moment is to make the point that's, I think, fairly important to make when we're talking about this subject. And that is, we talk about service industries versus goods industries. But in true economic terms, all of the industries on that chart are service industries. You see, in a sense, agriculture is a service industry, because we don't make the soil, we don't make the water, we don't make the sunshine, we don't make anything. We simply put it together, which is a service. And I don't know any statistician in the world in doing the national accounts has ever taken credit for creating the soil or the water or the sunshine. They just don't do it. So you see, agriculture is a service industry. Mining is a service industry. I was once talking to a mining conference years and years ago, and questioning how they thought they were so important to the economy. And one guy said to me, I said, take Jack here, he's from Hammersley Iron Ore. He makes all the iron ore that we stick on a ship and send it across the rest of the world. Brings all the money back and keeps the service industries going. I said, look, I'm probably pretty stupid, but I thought you said that, you know, Jack made the iron ore. He said, yeah, you got that right. I said, I thought God made the iron ore. I thought you guys were just sort of Grace Brothers removals. You picked it up from one point, took it to another as a service. Now, I had the car running outside the hall, of course, because you can't say those things and get away with it. But in fact, mining is a service industry. It's nothing more than a service industry. Manufacturing is a service industry because none of us made the materials that go into manufacturing. All we do is convert them, which is a service. So in a sense, it's very important when we look at productivity to know that every industry in the economy is a service industry. It's just that some of the products come out as tangible and some come out as intangible. That's the only difference, but they are all service industries. Now you might ask, well, why was it for so long that the so-called goods industries were more productive than the service industries? And the answer is because we had technology helping the goods industries and we didn't have technology helping the service industries for so long. In other words, we had things like electricity and stuff, and we had things like Ford's invention of the production line and all sorts of things like that. We had technology coming to the aid of those first 5 industries on that chart, the 2 primary industries and the 3 secondary industries. Technology came to the aid of the party. And it's only been more recently that technology is coming to the aid of the rest of the industries, which we do call service industries. And I think Beth Webster's final part of this contribution on the digital era is important because the digital era is a very important part of what's coming to the aid of the party of service industries. Now, already ICT, in other words, information communications technology, has been a big boon to the service industries, no doubt about that. In which case, if you like, the digital era, which is made up of fast broadband, artificial intelligence, analytics, etc., is like a turbocharged ICT. And in the industrial age, people would forget that it wasn't just electricity that got going early. It was water power and steam power long before we had electricity. And in this new age we're in of what we call service industries, it's coming in 2 stages. ICT, which has been around since 1965 in the way of computers and software, and now it's coming in the form of what we call the digital era since 2007. And if we are seeing a lot of pickup in the productivity of service industries, I think it's because already you're starting to feel the digital era cut in and improve it a lot. And that's why I think Beth's paper was very important in that regard. In terms of where the jobs are coming from, this is again interesting. There's very few jobs coming out of the goods industries. And you can see there the only ones were out of construction, and that may not be true in another 5 years' time. In other words, almost all the jobs are coming from the service industries, which is another reason why this is such a topical and important subject to be covering by CEDA, because if almost all the jobs and if almost all the economy is coming out of services, we better get much better at it than we've been for some time. Now that takes me into one of the reasons why we've got to get competitive, and that's the region we live in. This is a very quick reminder that the world is slowly aggregating its countries, and there's 230 countries in the world. We are slowly aggregating them into 8 regions, and maybe one day we'll condense those into 4. Probably by the year 2000 we may well do that. But we're into an aggregation stage at the present time. The EU, of course, is one of them, which I call Western and Central Europe there. North America is another one because you've got NAFTA, which Trump's trying to undo, of course, but that's Canada, USA and Mexico. The South Americans are trying to get together under the Bolivian Agreement. We've got APEC, which is a club really for the Asia-Pacific nations. So bit by bit, we're trying to get our act together to make more economies of scale and particularly get more peace. Now, the only relevant part of that chart to us is Asia, because almost 3/4 of our trade is now in Asia, our imports and exports. Over 2/3 of all of our new immigrants are coming from Asia, and 2/3 of all of our tourist visitors. And tourism is one of the things we've looked at also in this report. So that the Asia-Pacific, or more particularly Asia at large, is very, very much where our future lies. Now, the difference between Asia and the other two is that simply the Asian mega region consists of the Asia-Pacific, which is everything south of China, and it includes the Indian subcontinent of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Maldives and Sri Lanka. And we generally refer to that as Asia. And Asia is now 40% of the world's economy. Incidentally, China alone has overtaken the United States economy early last year. So the new president can whistle Dixie, but their power's gone, or going, the same as it went from England, if you like, the beginning of the last century. So nobody quite likes handing over the baton once it goes, and it takes about 20 to 25 years to know what to do with the damn baton, because America didn't have a clue what to do with being the biggest power, for a long, long time. In fact, it was 25 years She was in power as the world's biggest nation before World War II. Didn't know what to do with it. World War II was the thing that finally decided America had to grasp a baton and become the world leader. And China will take that role on as well, but it's going to take another 25 years to get the hang of it. Now, the point is, our future is in Asia. It's not with America, and it's not with England. And England can say, well, we're leaving the EU, that's Brexit, and we'll just renegotiate our way and go back to trading with Australia and New Zealand and India and all the countries that used to be part of the glorious Commonwealth of Australia. Well, you can wait till hell freezes over, it ain't going to happen. There's no way, no on demand we're going to deal with any more with England we do now. That was why I've always thought Brexit was just one of the silliest damn mistakes I think I've seen, for the last 10 years. You don't try to go it alone in a world that's aggregating for economies of scale. It's called suicide. You just don't do it. You've got no friends left when you do that. So, and divorces always end up with tears, and sadly that's what's happening at the present time with England. But that won't matter, because eventually they will go back into the EU, whether it's called something else at that stage, doesn't much matter. We cannot fly it alone anymore. Why do I raise Asia? Because their productivity rate is running at just over 4% per annum. 4% per annum. Our productivity has run at 1.7% for the last 100 years. It's run slightly higher than that in the last 5 years, about 1.8. So we're doing as well right now as we've ever done in the entire history of Australia, but we're no longer dealing with America or competing with America and England or Europe. We're now competing with Asia, and their productivity is twice ours, just over twice. So that's where the high jump bar's been set, and that's what really becomes the great challenge we've got. But I shouldn't go on without saying Asia is the place to be. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else at the present time. It's the right place to be in this very, very exciting world. And I've already made the point there where our trade and everything else is going. There's no doubt our population is going to change. We're already seen at the tail end of the last century that we're on our way to slowly becoming Eurasian, and with 2/3 of our migrants coming in from Asia, of course we're going to be that. So by the end of this century, we're definitely a Eurasian society, probably far better looking too. And that's the blokes. The women are already pretty, but and good looking, but the blokes will get much better looking. And by the following century, we'll be probably Asian. In other words, we're part of Asia. We're going to be an Asian society, both in looks, but a very rich Asian society, including all the Western trends that we've picked up along the way to make ourselves enjoy life more. Enough of that. That's the size of the Asia-Pacific region, and that's where we fit. We're the green sliver. If you've got your binoculars, you'll find it. And so there's a couple of elephants in that room, as you can notice too. It's called China and India, of course, and it simply reminds us that if we're going to bat above our weight, which we've usually done very well in Australia for a couple of hundred years, we're going to have to certainly be very, very picky at what we're good at going forward in this very, very competitive age. Okay, now that's the growth of the Asian neighbours we've got. And you'll find Australia somewhere down there. We're in there somewhere, but not very high up, I think, from memory. Yes, we're about the sixth from the bottom. We should be running at 3.5%, which is our average long-term growth. We haven't been there for the last 10 years, mainly because we haven't had good government for 10 years, unfortunately. But anyway, we can but hope that that will change. But look at the countries up the top, ones that you would have classed as third world countries, run by tyrants and all sorts of things. They're coming good. And they're coming good without any foreign aid, because the only thing you need to run a good country is have an honest government or an honest leader. Once you've got that, companies will pour the money in and away you go. Enough of that. Asia's productivity, I think, is one of the great challenges we've got. As I said, it's been running for over 4% per annum in output. That's, in other words, output per hour worked over the last many, many years, which is over twice our rate. So we do have an enormous challenge in front of us. Enough of that. So what is the productivity challenge? Well, here's the productivity growth of all the 19 industries we've got over the last 5 years, and we've looked at 6 of these in this report. I shouldn't say we, because I didn't contribute to it at all. I'd love to have done that, but they've done very well without me, I can tell you. That report is well worth reading cover to cover twice. But anyway, I'll use we, just because you can use the royal we sometimes. But you can see where the productivity's been. I've put the green arrows in where the report has covered them, those 6 industries, okay? So it's covered finance and insurance, which is done very well, and the report makes that point. and explains why they've done well too. At 3.2%, it's way above the average for the whole of Australia, both then and for a long, long time to come. Health surprised everybody by being slightly above the average too, or around about average too at 1.8%. It's traditionally not there. But in the last 5 years, something is starting to happen, and maybe Rowan will explain that in more detail if he has a choice during question time, and others can do the same too. But then you've got, if you like, transport and postal, which is pretty bad. So too is, of course, hospitality, and that's the nearest equivalent we've got to the tourism industry because it covers accommodation and eating out, of course. Retail does belong in tourism too, but not much. Then you've got education, and that's sad. Now, there's a lot of difficulties, as Kyle's already said, and the report makes out. How do you measure productivity in the service industry where it's not as easy to look at in terms of the quality of output compared to the quantity? The quantities we know, but we don't know the quality. Now, I think that problem was always there with the goods industries anyway as well. I mean, one car wasn't like another car. The only way you could tell the difference was the price. And to some extent, that suggestion is made in this report too, that maybe you've got to look at the price to some extent to decide whether the quality, therefore, has got a value to it that should be treated a little bit higher than just sheer volume. But anyway, education, I think, nevertheless, is a problem. I think it's going to be going through a revolution, not so much primary and secondary, although secondary does need to go through, I think, another revolution. I think most research coming out right across the world today is that the silliest mistake that we ever made in secondary education was to halve the class size from 45 to 22. All the research is showing that was one of the worst mistakes we made back in the early 80s. The reason being that you're far better to have a first class teacher, fully well rewarded, teaching 45 kids, maybe broken up to 3 lots of 15 in the class. Some are sitting in front of a computer, some are being tutored and some are doing their own thing. You can easily handle 45 with a first class teacher, which is far better than having second grade teachers, if you like that one. They're all human beings, they're all going to go to heaven, I'm not disputing that. But the mistake was trying to do that, and the only way we could cover off that cost was to halve the cost of teachers, really. That's the only way we could afford it in real terms. So education, I think at secondary, is due for another revolution, and to take full advantage of the new technology that can help with education as well, even at secondary level. Tertiary, I think, is going to get the biggest revolution ever, and I see the new cycle in university starting around about the year 2021 or 22 at the very latest, and that will so transform universities. We will never, by the time that cycle's finished over the next 45 years of that, we will never recognise universities for what they were in the past. And that's going to be very exciting and very, very productive. Professional and technical services are down there very, very low too, and the report highlights all of this. And that's a problem because most professional services, be they lawyers or accountants, are very monasterial rather than productive. And that has to be addressed. In fact, that very monasterial style has left itself wide open to do-it-yourself type services. And in America, where we analyse all their industries in my company too, we're doing it's 2 reports now on law. One is the traditional law and the other one's do-it-yourself law. And do-it-yourself law is growing at something like 4 times the pace of do-it-for-me. Enough of that. This is what that looks like over the last 5 years, but I want to very quickly, knowing I should wrap up, have a look at what 10 years has done, and the answer is not a lot of difference until you look at the summary of those 5 sectors, and you can see they're much closer over a 10-year period, which comes back to Kyle's point that, in a sense, if you like, the quaternary sector and the tertiary sector were right up there, and in fact doing better than the primary sector anyway over that period of time of 10 years. So, in a sense, there is still a crisis, and that comes out more from the previous chart than this one, but it's not quite as grim as it used to be, and I think, as I say, that's probably why we are going to see some changes coming through that's going to help the party. What do I see to cover, and I'm going to finish off in the next 1 minute. Well, as I said, we've covered, there were 12 papers across 6 industries with 20 authors, covering those 6 areas. The weighted average of the service divisions that were covered were just 0.5% over the 5 years compared to 1.8, and over the 10 years it was about 1.5, and that was still lower than the rate at the time. So yes, there is a problem, and it's specific to 2 or 3 of those 6 industries more than the whole lot. The recommendations, I think I'll run out of time to cover all of these, but there's just 2 very quick pages of recommendations, and most of them are put to the government. And I think it's worth touching on just a couple of these very quickly. The first is to get governments to resist the inevitable pressure to place barriers in the way of change, because they do that, to remove existing barriers assisted by the Productivity Commission, to support greater transparency of health information. I'm sure that'll come up in question time too. And productivity through business systems, particularly innovation in healthcare. Now, I think time says that I won't be able to go through all of these, but just to make a couple of other points. I think if you go to the bottom one area there too, I think it's increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of university governance and administration, because education is a worry. There's no doubt to my mind. And to ensure that universities fully embrace the opportunities provided by the digital revolution. Now, I think most universities know that's coming. I mean, universities currently, it costs us pretty close to $30 billion to run them. We're putting about 1.35 million students through them in any given year. But the real cost of putting a student through a university has not changed from the time I graduated in 1961. It's still exactly the same cost per student. In other words, roughly around about 18,000, 19,000 per student, whatever it is. That converted back to 1961 terms is the same. It's one of the few industries I know in Australia that's had no measurable productivity gain over the last sort of almost, whatever that turns out to be, over 50 years. It's quite frightening. Now, that doesn't take account of quality, and I'm not sure about that, but I know there's only 2 semesters today. There was 3 when I went through. The exposure hours in those days were 28 hours a week. It's no longer that. So I'm not trying to say it was better in the old days, because it wasn't. Half the stuff I told you turned out to be wrong. That's not the point, but it suggests, however, that there is a challenge, and it's not peculiar to Australia either. There is a revolution required in knowledge and in information, and sometimes I think that's coming faster through Google than it is any other point. I mean, you've got young kids now sitting quietly in a corner during a family lunch, saying not boo because they've got a PC in their lap or they've got a phone or something like that. Kids are becoming knowledgeable, even if they're playing games at the age of 2. By the time they get to sort of ready to finish high school, they're scary. And when you start employing them after university, they're frightening, as far as I'm concerned. They're so damn smart, May not be wise, that I hold that out against them, but by God, they're smart. So I just finish on the point that the digital era and the age of information and IP coming through has to be one of the great saviours for the service industries as we know them. Thanks for listening.